There was a time when the first thing I did anytime I got on a computer is opened up an internet browser and went to pitchfork.com. I discovered Pitchfork when I was in college, and having been raised on a diet primarily of classic rock, was looking for something to help guide me into the world of alternative or indie or underground rock music. And after finding some sites like Digital Dream Door, which I think is still out there in what appears to be its original form, I stumbled upon Pitchfork. And I actually discovered Pitchfork through their greatest albums of the 1990s list, which has now been superseded by an updated version of that list. Now, a lot has changed since Pitchfork issued the list that I discovered when I was in college. That was a long time ago. They've got new ownership. They've got, I'm sure, like an entirely new staff, and more power to them for wanting to take the list in a different direction. But the fact remains that as Pitchfork's sort of like genre focus broadens and changes, they become a little bit less aligned with the more narrow set of genres that I am interested in today, and certainly was interested in when I found them. Some of you out there might remember old Pitchfork, but some of you might not. And whether you're looking to reminisce in what Pitchfork used to be, or looking to learn what Pitchfork used to be, I'm making this video to share with you some of my favorite, I guess, like ephemera from old Pitchfork. When I first discovered Pitchfork, their faceless writers, faceless to me, were just like the ultimate indie music snobs, which in many contexts would be pretty grating, and sometimes it was. But often they were also really, really funny. A great example of this is the reviews that Pitchfork made of the first two albums by the Australian band Jet. Every critical review I've ever read of a Jet album was dismissive, but I loved Get Born when it came out in 2003, mostly because I wasn't familiar with most of the music that it was knocking off. I didn't recognize that drum beat from Lust for Life, and I didn't realize that Look What You Done was almost exclusively lyrics poached from Beatles songs. My fondness for that record didn't prevent me from laughing out loud at Pitchfork's review of that album, which I think is a perfect example of their style of humor and their snobbery, which in this case I think is pretty well placed. And then their review of the next album, which is called Shine On, is, dare I say, one of the classic pieces of internet memedom. If you haven't seen either of those reviews before, you should check them out. The second thing I want to recommend is not a review, but a long-form article. Pitchfork still does a lot of long-form articles, but I loved their long-form articles back in the day and spent a lot of time reading them. One of my favorites is an article that I'm surprised is still on the main website. It's called Twee as Fuck, and it's subtitled The Story of Indie Pop. It provides, I think, a really interesting, well-written history of early indie music, like the things that maybe one day evolved into the alternative nation, but started much, much smaller than that. And if you've ever been curious about the sounds that maybe could help you build some connection in your mind between Kurt Cobain and Belle and Sebastian, the article gives you a nice insight into some of those sounds and artists. And as an added bonus, the article is well written and it's funny. And as you can guess from the title, it's kind of irreverent. And that was great. And the more I read of like early Pitchfork stuff, the more I enjoyed that aspect of the brand. Those two key factors, like sort of irreverent internet humor and snobbery, date back to the earliest days of Pitchfork, when it wasn't pitchfork.com, it was pitchforkmedia.com. The website was started in the mid-1990s, and a lot of the content from the early site is not present on the new site. I don't know the history of that decision. I don't know when that decision was made, but at some point when the platform transferred over to pitchfork.com, I guess they didn't port over everything from the original site. They chose some things to bring forward, but other things they didn't. Now, I don't really know if it happened as part of a larger transition or if things have been culled over the years, but there are a lot of things that used to be part of official Pitchfork that are now kind of apocryphal. And this is my favorite era and area of the Pitchfork story. It's stuff that you can only find using the Internet Archive. If you've never spent time with the Internet Archive, you should. It really might be the best thing on the internet, and I'm not exaggerating. So if you went to Pitchfork Media on the Wayback Machine, what would you find? Well, you'd find a bunch of album reviews that never made it to the main site. Two in particular stand out in my mind. I discovered old Pitchfork on the Wayback Machine when I was reading Wikipedia about Ben Folds Five's first album, the self-titled debut, and I saw that Pitchfork had given that record a 9.6, which is a very high score for Pitchfork. But then when I clicked the link, I couldn't find it on the main Pitchfork site. I could only get it through this Wayback Machine archived version. And there it is. It's a short, simple review, but written in a style very different from like modern Pitchfork. And, you know, I don't think modern Pitchfork would give that record a 9.6. It's a good record, but that's like kind of a high review, and there's not a whole lot of justification in the written review for that review. And maybe that's why the review didn't make it into new Pitchfork. It just doesn't have enough substance, and maybe they don't agree with the rating. But the fact is that at some point, the founder of Pitchfork deemed it worthy of that rating and that review, and it's kind of cool to know that it's still out there, even if only in kind of like an unsanctioned or unofficial rendering. The second review that stands out in my mind is a review of Pearl Jam's fifth album, Yield, which Pitchfork gave an 8.5 when it was released back in 1998. That review does not appear on the existing Pitchfork website, and I don't think it was there when I first discovered Pitchfork more than a decade ago. Pearl Jam hasn't been that fashionable for a long time, but they were one of the classic 90s bands and continued to release, I think, consistent material. And they were always just dismissed by Pitchfork, and that's something that frustrated me and then confounded me when I found the review of Yield, which is in its way kind of dismissive because that's the style of so many of those reviews, but then ultimately I think very positive. Maybe that's another example of the type of content that new Pitchfork doesn't really think is relevant to the site. Maybe Pearl Jam or Dinosaurs are representative of something that they're not interested in representing anymore. But there are people out there who like Pearl Jam, and if you're interested in what a bunch of indie music snobs thought of Pearl Jam records when they were released in the late 90s, you can go check it out on the Internet Archive. But I think the real treasure that you can find on the Wayback Machine from those early days of Pitchfork, pitchforkmedia.com and pitchfork.com, are some of the early, best albums lists that they issued, and that now are not present on the live site. The first of note is the very first Best of the 1990s list that they issued back in 1999. This list has been superseded twice now, first I think in 2003 and now in the last week, and you might think that it doesn't have anything to offer, but that's not true. It's interesting to see what a indie or rock fan thought about the state of rock music and the state of a fairly interesting decade at the very end of that decade. In the intro to the first revised version of the list, the editors talk about how opinions can change, and that's absolutely true and totally fair. But it's still nice to have some record of what those earlier opinions were. One of the best things I can say about the new version of the 90s albums list is that they haven't deleted the old list. Now, who knows what's going to happen to it in the future, but today it remains on the main website. I wish they had taken the same approach with respect to this very first 1990s list. The second lost list is in a way even more interesting and more of a tragedy for us to have lost. In the mid-2000s, Pitchfork issued a sort of stopgap best of list. They surveyed the albums released between 2000 and 2004 and made a long best of that period list. In a way, that list was superseded a few years later when they did a larger decade in review that covered, in part, the same time span, but I still think that the old list was really valuable. It's a great survey of music that was released during that period, which is a time when Pitchfork was growing pretty fast and sort of refining its identity. And it highlights albums that did not make the Decade in Review list. And in a way, to me, it's just sort of like an appendix to the bigger list. Like if you want to do a deeper dive into things that might have been popular during that window, here you can use this list to find some things that didn't make the cut, but that were good enough to merit special attention in the middle of the decade. I don't really understand why Pitchfork removed that list, but that's exactly what they did. I can't seem to find it on the main website, so you have to go to the Wayback Machine to find it. And when I say go to the Wayback Machine, don't worry, you don't actually have to go there yourself and seek these things out. I'm going to link all of the things I've talked about in this video in the description for this video, so that you too can go experience and hopefully enjoy the flavors of old Pitchfork. Of course, Pitchfork is still around, but I think they've made obvious in the last couple of years that they're more than willing to revisit and revise the perspectives that they expressed about music in the past, maybe in a time when their genre focus was quite a bit narrower than it is today. And while I know those revised lists contain some amazing albums that either weren't on the earlier lists or weren't ranked that high on the earlier lists, there's something is lost there. But not totally lost, I guess, because thank God for the Wayback Machine. And that's all I have to say. If you like this, please like it, subscribe to my channel if you want more content that's like this. Even though this is not like most of the things that I post, you might still like the other stuff. And in the comments, let me know how you first experienced Pitchfork and what your thoughts were about it. I'm nostalgic by nature and most interested in a conversation about old Pitchfork, but if you want to talk about new Pitchfork too, that's fine with me, I suppose. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I'll see you around.